Hi! I want to talk today about the combat style known as energy fighting in War Thunder, specifically using it against the classical energy fighters of the BF-29s and Focke-Wulf 190s of the Axis, although the topics and maneuvers I cover in this video apply equally to any combat situation against any nation in War Thunder. I'm flying out my Spitfire F Mark 14C in realistic battles mode. I personally like this mode as I play on a HD TV, so the dot spotting inherent in simulator battles leads mostly to eye strain and generally a pretty lonely experience. I really like the Spitfire 14C, mainly due to its incredible power to weight ratio and fantastic climb, while also maintaining good overall manoeuvrability. Also, as this is the C model rather than the E, there's a battle rating of 5.7 rather than 5.3, which I think is a little fairer to the opposition. Another nice thing about this plane at this battle rating is that it often fights its historical opponents of the late G series and K series 109s, as well as D model Focke-Wulfs. Sadly, it also spends a lot of time flying against Bearcats and Mustangs, but that's a topic for another video. Today we're flying on the Ruhr map against the Germans. The engagement is well underway, and I see a 109 which I have been fighting previously in the distance. I think he sees me when I reach about 2 kilometers, so he begins to come around, potentially to set up a head-on pass. Now, in a Spitfire this is definitely not an ideal situation. I see he's a K model, which is a very capable plane that matches mine in most regards, and has a better power to weight ratio than say a G10, so I need to be very careful with my vertical manoeuvring. I'm just about to complete my Immelmann turn when I consider enough distance has been achieved between us, so I continue the loop down and roll out of it to set up a shot. The K-4 tries to counter with an energy trap, rolling out of my line of fire, so I pull back up and convert my speed back into altitude so I can make another pass later. As I begin climbing, I see another 109 heading pretty much straight towards me. However, I judge him to be at too low of an energy state to be a real threat. I soon realise he's switched targets to the last remaining player on our team, the F8F, so I start planning how I'm going to approach the situation and try and take the heat off him. I level out the plane to build up a little bit more speed and really get an idea of where his flight path is going to take him before banking over towards him. I roll the plane slightly, pull the nose around, and then decide I'm going to enter a long, lazy split S to try and pull my nose around behind him and get a good shot. The Focke-Wulf is either ignoring me or just simply doesn't know I'm here, so I can start my dive in comfort and know he's unlikely to be able to counter it in any way. He rolls inverted, potentially trying to chase down the F8F, and thanks to my great elevator authority until about 400 knots, I'm able to land a killing blow. I immediately pull back up and see the first 109 on his way back to the battle, but again he seems to be concentrating on the Bearcat. I go into a gentle turn, still climbing, before heading into a lead pursuit to try and close the distance. He seems to be moving quite quickly, which is always a worry with a 109, so I do my best to gain as much altitude as I can before going into the fight. It's always better to approach an enemy with an altitude advantage. It gives you more options and more opportunities to disengage if you feel like the fight's not going your way. He seems to be moving very quickly, so I do my best to gain a little bit more energy before going into a split S and trying to set up an attack. I dive down on him, however, in his attempts to set up an attack on the F8F, he rolls and maneuvers extremely hard. He eventually begins to pull out of his turn into a climb, possibly to make another attack on the Bearcat, and in doing so he exchanges nearly all of his speed for altitude. This is a critical mistake with enemy fighter behind him, and again I'm able to throw the nose into his flight path to score some hits. Unfortunately, while the visual effect is dramatic, I seem to do little damage to his aircraft. I come around in a loop as I still have a good amount of energy, and he appears to be struggling with the controls of his aeroplane. I see a 190 down low, still in the fight, but judge that it is too low and slow to be a threat at this point and continue my attack. The K-4 continues to chase the F8F and I start landing hits, then a hit from one of my cannons shears off his right wing and he's out of the fight. I pull back up to regain some altitude and have another glance around for enemy fighters. I notice that the Focke-Wulf has now switched targets to me and is gaining on me quite quickly, so I decide to leverage the Griffin's excellent climb rate, which I know he cannot match, to try and regain an energy advantage. I give it full emergency power and go for a gentle spiral climb, which I will then tighten once he gets towards firing range. This is a very good manoeuvre to pull against a slower climbing enemy fighter, but you have to make sure you're very aware of their distance to you, as they may be able to land a killing shot before you finish the manoeuvre. I begin to tighten the turn, which has the effect of leaving the Focke-Wulf nose high with very little airflow over his wings, and facing the possibility of a stall. This is an ideal situation for an energy fighter, as it puts the enemy at a massive disadvantage to you, who still, hopefully, has control of your aircraft. He tries to get some shots off on me, but there's no way he can do it at this kind of range and at this low speed, so he has no choice but to dive away or risk stalling. I pull my aircraft round and do my best to get behind him. Go into a split S and roll to match the plane of his wings, and after initially missing my first deflection shots, I adjust my aim upwards and score some good hits, shearing off what looks like a wingtip and control surface and setting fire to the 190. Unfortunately the fire goes out straight away, but that's just how it goes sometimes. Suddenly I'm greeted with the very worrying sight of a 109 at high altitude heading right for me. This is definitely not good, as he's likely at a higher energy level than me and will not have a hard time lining up an attack run. Most competent 109 pilots will stick almost entirely to boom and zoom tactics, for which the plane is very well suited with a relatively light airframe and high power, and in many planes it's very hard to beat. I do my best to try and build up as much speed as I can, but then I realise that my engine is almost completely overheated, and I have no choice but to do my best to cool it off. This is absolutely the worst time this could possibly happen. Anyway, it seems he switches targets to the F8F, which is pretty much exactly what I wanted. Grateful for the temporary reprieve, I climb away hard, do my best to pull as much energy and altitude as I can over him, though I know that he's at a huge advantage, and it's probably not going to be long until he comes up and sees what I'm doing. In fact, he now sees me and turns right towards me, and I have no choice but to do my best and extend the chase as long as I can to give my high power to weight ratio a chance to even out the energy level between the two of us. The Spitfire climbs really well between 10,000 feet and 18,000 feet, and then again from 22,000 feet. If you know these altitude ranges, it can really help you out a lot in combat. I realise as our energy levels begin to even out that this gives me a perfect opportunity to set up one of my favourite energy fighting manoeuvres, the rope-a-dope. The rope-a-dope gives the enemy the appearance that you're vulnerable and trying to climb away from the fight, when in fact you maintain a lot more energy than it appears, and you can use this to your advantage. I know I have a good 50 knots of headroom left before my plane starts to stall, so I pull hard into a spiral climb to strip away as much of the 109's energy as I can, and indeed as I tighten the circle he ends up almost 90-degree pitch, very rapidly losing control of his aircraft. Firing his guns only makes the situation worse thanks to the recoil, and his plane starts to stall. In 2 minutes I have converted an energy disadvantage into an advantage, and I'm able to roll into a split S and dive down on him as he tries to regain control of his aircraft. I land a glancing blow with a deflection shot, but it doesn't cause major damage, but a reason that most of the enemy team are now out of the fight, so I can afford to blow a little bit of energy to try and follow him in his dive. My efforts are rewarded with a few more hits, though nothing major, and as he dives away further I elect to break off my attack and climb back up to avoid any of his teammates. Sadly, as I do this, he lands a critical blow on the surviving Bearcat. He doesn't make it. We rejoin the fight 20 minutes later, and it's just me and him left in the game. I cannot find him, so I've been flying around at about 20,000 feet searching when I decide to drop altitude and look for him beneath the clouds. This turns out to be a huge error, as a lucky glance shows me that he's set up an attack position on me from a much greater altitude. I can actually work this to my advantage, as energy fighting is all about equalizing the energy states between combatants. I reason that with a shallow dive I can force him into a high speed pass that will cause his control surfaces to compress and stiffen. Then, just before he gets in range, I can pull up hard in a manoeuvre that I know he cannot match. It costs me a lot of energy, but thanks to the cloud bank he will not see exactly where I've gone, so I keep climbing, expecting to find him up on top of the clouds, setting up for another pass. It is in fact quite a while until I'm able to visually reacquire the target. When I do see him, I realise he's at a much lower altitude than me, likely expecting me to drop back out of the cloud looking for him. So, I can leverage this and dive on him at a high speed to close the distance. The game is about to come to a draw on time at this point, thanks to ground unit ticket bleed, so I know I need to work fast if I want to close the deal. I decide to risk engine fire as I give the engine all power I can and overheat both oil and water, but it's so close to the end of the match it's worth the risk. At just over 3 kilometers, he makes a final major mistake and pulls around in a wide, flat banking turn to head for me. This should almost never be done in a 109, as it tends to bleed energy when manoeuvring in the horizontal. It much prefers to manoeuvre in the vertical, thanks to its high power to weight ratio. I go into a high yo-yo turn to try and get around behind him, and then the game is pretty much won at this point. I have a massive energy advantage, I can close the distance quite easily, and all he can do is make relatively slow evasive manoeuvres to try and avoid my possible attacks. It's as simple as making a series of low speed sweeping turns to stay behind him at this point. I know that my Griffin outmanoeuvres his G-series, and it's very easy to set up an attack run just using high yo-yo turns and nice easy rolls. In an apparently desperate attempt to get away, it makes a hard banking turn to the right, but this has no real effect other than to pull away even more of his already limited energy. We're now both getting very low and very slow, but in fact I have a lot more speed than he does, as you can see, almost 400 knots at this low altitude. In makes another hard banking turn and then appears to try to climb away from the fight, but at this point it's far too late. I quickly close the distance and set up an easy shot. However, a large number of my shots seem to do no damage. Rather embarrassingly, I finally misjudged the roll rate of my aircraft, and sadly, after taking off his elevator, we just clip wings as I try to separate. Both our planes become missiles at this point, but his was already pointed at the ground, so Allies win the battle. I hope you enjoyed this short video and found some of the fighting tips and explanations useful. I hope to see you again next time.